I thought I'd talk briefly about the U.S. perspective on where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. And I think it's a particularly appropriate time to have that discussion because we're at a interesting and important juncture here as far as the Doha negotiations are concerned. But to start off first by stepping back just a little bit about where we've been. I think it is significant that in the past several months, the U.S. and many others in Geneva have succeeded in what I think of as restarting the engines of the Doha negotiations. And there have been several aspects of that. I think the small group process that we engaged in over the course of the fall was very significant in that it helped us collectively to make the segue from only talking about process to beginning to talk about substance. Part of that process of talking about substance was very helpful to me, and I think it was very helpful to many of my colleagues and counterparts in Geneva in getting a sense of how the various issues that are out there need to be crystallized. And I think it was, in some ways, a very important way of specifically engaging all of the ambassadors in the negotiations. One of the things that we heard over the course of the fall is that many people were looking for explicit political signals from the U.S. and from other leaders in the world. And one of the things that we worked very hard to deliver was an explicit statement coming out of both APEC and the G20 focusing on the Doha negotiations. And I think I can say without fear of contradiction that there was no one at the G20 leaders meeting who was more detailed or more explicit in his comments on Doha than President Obama. He reiterated his commitment to the WTO and to Doha. He indicated his willingness to take a good agreement, if it can be reached, before the U.S. Congress. He was very clear in stating our ambitions for the round and what we're seeking, but he also indicated that he understands that negotiations, by definition, involve a process of give and take. And he also very directly challenged the emerging economies, the Indias, Chinas, and Brazils, to step up to their responsibilities as major players in the global economy. Having come back, all of us, from APEC and the G20, what we did in Geneva in the sort of dying days of December was to lay out a process and a structure for January to ensure that we could come back and have the potential to hit the ground running. And we're in the midst already of what, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, will be meetings at every level. Experts, ambassadors, senior officials, even a couple of opportunities at Davos and elsewhere for ministers to have direct exchanges on Doha. And so that's a segue, really, from my standpoint, into where we're at. And where we're at right now, I think, to state it succinctly, is we're all out of process. There's no process left to do, and what that means is that the only thing that's left is negotiating. And that said, it's clear to me that the central question of the round, that the central question of whether or not we'll succeed in Doha remains the question of whether the emerging economies are prepared to accept the responsibility that comes along with their position in the global economy. If they're prepared to accept that responsibility, we'll have a successful outcome. If they're not prepared to accept that responsibility, we won't. For the part of the United States, let me say very clearly that we are ready, willing, and able to negotiate anywhere, to negotiate any issue, to negotiate with anybody except ourselves. And that last point is an important one because we need interlocutors across the table from us who are prepared to talk about the key substantive issues that we've all worked to identify over the past several months. I think it's very important to emphasize that the eyes of the world are on all of the major players in this round. I hear sometimes that there's the people are looking to the United States, and that's appropriate, but the world has changed, and it's no longer the case that the U.S. or a couple of developed countries can dictate the agendas and outcomes of the WTO. We have a larger leadership table now, and everybody knows that that includes the emerging economies. And so the world is looking toward all of us to shoulder our appropriate share of the burden. The last thing I'll say before opening it for questions is that I firmly believe that we can have a successful outcome of the round this year, if. And the if is comes back to the question of whether we start immediately negotiating, doing the work that has to be done.